Well, good morning, everyone. Thank you very much for spending a little bit of your morning listening to basically myself, Chris Kirk, and one of my colleagues effectively ramble on a little bit about some of the more intricate pieces of Azure technology that are out and about at the moment. So this is part of our long-standing webinar series that we're doing on Azure predominantly. Where we kind of try to give you something a little bit more interesting in terms of the technology that's about, or the new features that are coming out in Azure, that we feel that as a business, and as you grow with your Azure usage, you're going to come across at some point, and you'll probably find it hopefully quite useful. So just to get some introductions out of the way, in case you've not attended one of these webinars before. So my name is Chris Kirk. I'm a senior technical consultant here at Ultima. I cover purely Azure. So I cover infrastructure as a service, platform as a service, DevOps, automation, and any of the other 200 products in Azure that Microsoft decides to release probably between now and next week at the sheer rate of development that Microsoft are pushing this products that we can see in Azure. I've also delighted to be joined by one of my other senior colleagues. So I've got Alex Gravatt-Ball with me today. Alex, didn't we just want to quickly introduce yourself in terms of what you're going to be talking about as well?
Hi, Chris. Can you hear me okay? I'm allowed to speak now. Excellent. Hi, guys. So I'm Alex. I've been at Ultima an awful long time, and I have one foot in the traditional world on premise and one foot in the Azure world. So I tend to cover off a lot of the hybrid technologies that we see around Azure.
Cool. Thank you, Alex. Sorry about that. Usual technology troubles on a Wednesday morning, but anyway, moving on. So as I've already mentioned, as part of the webinar series, what we're trying to do is we're trying to take specific technologies and services that are available in Azure that we think customers are going to find very interesting to have a little bit more knowledge about. And as you can see from the kind of the screenshot or the presentation at the moment, obviously there are, as I mentioned, nearly 200 services at the moment in Azure that we can actually explore. So what we try to do with these webinars is break down to something a bit more specific that we think you're going to find quite interesting. So for today's webinar, I'm going to talk a little bit about Azure Web Apps. So I'm going to give you a little bit of an introduction on how web apps work, how they kind of, I guess, differ to your traditional web applications running on virtual machines, and kind of how they work in the platform as a service world on that side of Azure as well as talking a little bit about the Azure Policies service that exists in Azure and how you can use that service to kind of guarantee what you're deploying and what you're looking at in terms of cost actually stays relatively in sync to what you actually expect. At that point, I'm then going to kind of switch the presentation over, and I'm going to pass it over to Alex, and he's going to talk a little bit about the Azure File Sync service, which is kind of one of Azure's newest major services that have come out in probably the last 6 months or so in terms of general availability. And that kind of will detail how you can use different file services in Azure using a more platform as a service side of things. So as mentioned, just kicking off the webinar, we're going to talk a little bit about Azure Web Apps in terms of how they actually work and a little bit about best practice, just to kind of introduce you to in terms of the functionality around that. And the reason we like to talk about the web apps on the platform as a service side is for most customers, you'll start using Azure, and predominantly it'll be an IaaS or infrastructure as a service focused deployment that you'll be looking at. So you'll be deploying your networking, you'll deploy your virtual machines, and you're deploying your disks and all that kind of lovely stuff. And at some point, from a traditional deployment view that we've seen with a lot of customers, you then start to look at the platform services that are available, such as SQL, which I talked about in the previous webinar, and now for the actual web app service. So the actual web app service is very much a IIS style service in Azure, but you just don't have the backing or the view of using virtual machines anymore. So you're losing that overhead of managing virtual machines and all the things that go with it in terms of the networking and the disks and patching and all that kind of thing. It's all taken care of for you behind the scenes. So you should think of web apps as basically an IIS instance in Azure. You just don't have a lot of that overhead as you find with a lot of traditional platform services. So this does support a range of languages. It's not purely just linked to Microsoft in terms of the actual languages for your web applications. Yes, the majority you'll see out there will be ASP.NET. That's kind of the flavor of the month, year, decade, no matter how you want to label it. But Microsoft are very good in terms of supporting other open source languages and other general languages in Azure in general, not just for web apps. So if you're working with Java or Node.js or PHP or Python, they are fully supported. There's tons of documentation from Microsoft in actually using them as a coding language for your web applications, and that is fully supported. In terms of the actual kind of the back end that these web applications are sitting on, traditionally this is Windows, even though you don't actually see it to a degree, but it also does support Linux as well. So if you're more used to deploying your web applications on a Linux-based service, then Microsoft do support that in Azure using the web apps, and that's a relatively new feature for web apps as well. Traditionally, it was just a case of you can deploy it, your code on this service, and it's very, when you get into nitty-gritty of looking at how the file structure looks and the back end, it's very IIS or Windows orientated. Now, Linux, Microsoft love Linux these days, so there is a Linux viewpoint for that as well, if you are that kind of orientated in terms of what you're used to on that side of things. In terms of the compute side of things, web apps use something called the app service, and that provides the actual core compute power behind your web applications. So you can have multiple web applications against one app service in terms of a relationship. The app service and the web apps have to exist in the same region as each other. So if you need to deploy your website in another region in Azure, you have to have another separate app service to that. That's kind of where the lock is, as it were, how it all has to be within the same region. And as is traditional with platform services like PadSQL, the scalability is where you really find the advantage with this. So you have two choices. You can scale horizontal or vertical, i.e. you could start with just one instance of effectively a Windows box behind the scenes, and depending on the tier you're on the app service, which we'll get to shortly, you can scale that out to multiple instances behind the scenes to manage the load for you. In terms of those instances, it is load balanced for you as well automatically. You don't see any load balancer or load balancing configuration. It's all done behind the scenes for you, so you don't have to worry about that if you do use multiple instances. If you want to scale, effectively larger, so you want more power rather than more instances, then that is available to you as well through the app service, which we'll talk a little bit more about later on. And just to cover this section off very quickly, it supports integration with Azure Active Directory. So if you want to do security or permissioning, like you've done on-premise with IIS, where you were using normal AD accounts, you can use Azure Active Directory to do that as well. And it does link into your virtual networking in terms of there is integration available for your web apps to connect to your virtual networks, and therefore back to on-premise if you do have some dependencies on virtual machines, such as if you have a web application using a web app, but you have SQL running in a VM, then you can connect those two together absolutely fine on that side of things as well. You're not limited to just using pure platform services. Just a couple more things. The backup service is fully integrated into web apps. You'll get full SLAs up to 99.95% depending on the app service tier, which we'll talk a little bit more about in a minute. And this is a perfect service to start using modern DevOps practices in terms of actually deploying code and your updated version of your website to the web app service. And I'm going to talk a little bit more about that one later on as well, because that's quite a large topic. It's worth a slide all on its own. So just to give you a little bit of information about how the compute works under the hood in terms of the app service. So very similar to PaaS SQL in this instance, if you were there for that webinar, if you've seen this before, we are dealing with tiering and different sub-tiering to give you more performance effectively and a few more features as well. So we do have a free dev tier and a basic tier, which are used just generally for mucking about. You don't really get any SLAs with that. You don't have the ability to do any backups per se, and scaling is non-existent on the free dev tier, but you do get a little bit of manual scaling on the basic tier. But it's the standard and premium tiers that you're going to be concentrating on for your production workloads. So that is going to give you your SLAs, that's going to give you your backups, so you can do 10 or 20 a day, depending on if you're going standard or premium. It's going to give you more storage. And it's going to give you what's referred to as auto scaling as well as a DR and a HA service using what's referred to as Traffic Manager, which again, I'm going to talk a little bit more about that in a DR and HA slide that I've got coming up as well. You can change the tiering on the fly. There is no downtime in terms of actually going from basic to standard, standard to premium, and all the sub-tierings in between. You just have to be very careful that if you're using, say, for example, if you're on the basic tier and you're using 9 gig of storage and you scale up to the standard tier for a few months and you end up with 12 gig of storage being used, therefore you can't scale back down because you've gone over the maximum amount of storage on the basic tier. So there are a few caveats to be aware of when you are scaling between the tiers, but like PaaS SQL, there's no downtime for actually changing these tiers or changing the sub tiers. So you can have the service that runs and then is optimized that's correct to the workload that you want to use, because the higher we go, obviously, with this, the more money it's going to cost you at the end of the day. So you can kind of move this about a little bit. And that kind of leads just to highlight with the scaling as well, that again, you may have seen this slide very similar if you were here for the SQL one a little while ago, because it's exactly the same. It's exactly the same process where we are in an OpEx cost model. Therefore, we're just paying for the amount of resource that we use. And generally speaking, the performance tier you're on is not required 24/7. So you do have the ability to scale your web apps higher or lower a couple of different ways. So with the auto scaling for your standard and your premium tiers, that will give you the ability to put some metrics in for CPU, disk, memory, data in, data out, etc. And you can basically tell the service that, for example, if I hit 90% CPU over 20 minutes, scale me up to the next tier or add another instance in. And if I go below 40% CPU, lower me by 1 on the actual tier or the number of instances I'm using. So the service will do that for you automatically, but it's also worth pointing out that some customers don't like that because they feel they don't have a huge amount of control in terms of actually what's going on. So the alternative option to that is to write an automation script using predominantly the set-Azure RM service plan PowerShell command. So you can write a PowerShell script that's on a schedule, and you can basically define the tier and the number of instances that you want at a certain point during the day. So if you know, for example, your website is very, very busy, let's take a retail example. Say it's Black Friday, for example. You know it's going to be very, very busy. Therefore, you can set an automation script to say, from 6 a.m., I want you to scale it up to this tier and this many instances. And then we know traditionally, when we get to about 10 p.m. in the evening kind of thing, we know it's going to start to trail off, scale me down to what we were on before. So you have more control over that scaling capability and therefore a bit more control over cost, and you therefore know kind of roughly what costs to expect on kind of using this tier. So like I say, it does work both ways. You can scale down and you can scale up. It doesn't matter which way around you do it as well. So you may have seen in the tiering slide that we talked, that we had a line about deployment slots for standard and your premium tiers as well. And for me, this is one of the biggest features of web apps in terms of your actual development work. So to give you a little example, we have the app service, which is our compute power for our web app. And we will have a production website that's got a custom URL against it, or just the Azure websites.net default URL. And that website within Azure, it will have application settings, which is very similar to your web.config file in IIS. And you may, for example, have a PAS-SQL database connected to that website via a connection string that you can also specify. But then the question becomes, okay, I need to make changes to that website. How do I do that in a safe manner and replicate what we have without basically causing an abrupt swap over and allow us to do a little bit of testing on that before we actually do that? So with the standard and premium tiers, we have this concept of deployment slots where I can have either 5 or 10 deployment slots of a particular website. And it basically means I can have an identical copy of that website that's actually completely separate from the website itself, from the production version. It means it will have a separate URL, it will have separate application settings. In this example, I've got a separate SQL backend. I could have the same SQL backend if I really wanted to. It's completely up to you. And then what I can then define with this is the ability to load an update into what I refer to as a pre-production deployment slot, give it a quick test in terms of the test checklist that I have, because I've got a separate URL for this. And then in Azure, there is ability to do a swap slot. So what we can do is it will take defined application settings and it will take the pre-production website and it will swap it into production, and the production version will get swapped into the pre-prod slot. So they will effectively swap over from each other. And while it does that, there is no downtime at all, guaranteed from Microsoft. And it will also do any kind of warm-up caching or anything like that for you as well. If there's a problem for whatever reason that you've missed something and you need to go back, you can just do it again. You can do swap slot and it will take what you've got into production back into pre-prod, and it will swap pre-prod back into production. So you were back where you were with kind of very little downtime in terms of that as well. So this is a very powerful feature with Web Apps in terms of giving you the ability to actually test this before you go into production. And it's worth noting that if you do have any application settings that you don't want to be swapped into production from pre-prod, you can define those settings as slot-specific settings. So if you have an application setting, for example, I've got a connectivity string for my pre-prod SQL server, I obviously don't want that setting to go into production. So I can put a little mark against that and say, when you do the swap, don't take this connection string in with you, keep it in this slot and don't override the production one. So it does also give you the ability to do that as well. On that side of things. So like I say, this is purely just standard and premium tier. You can't do it on the basic tier, but this is a major facility of this service that I genuinely recommend you check out more in the documentation. And that kind of leads us a little bit onto quite a large subject that is probably going to be a feature of a future webinar, but I just wanted to highlight this here just of how this kind of all fits together in terms of your development processes with web apps. And what we see more and more with customers is they're using something called VSTS or Azure DevOps, which is an automation and orchestration service available to you and your developers within Azure itself. So what this will allow you to do is your developers using something like Visual Studio, for example, if they've got an ASP.NET website, they'll be making their changes locally. They can commit their changes to this DevOps service, and I can have an orchestration or what's referred to as a pipeline to allow me to deploy those changes in a very orchestrated and automated way to my pre-production deployment slot, like we saw on the previous slide, and then I can assign testing and checks and all that kind of thing. And then the pipeline will then automatically or manual, depending on what you want to do, it will then do a swap slot for you as well as part of that service. So this is where kind of everything kind of fits together in one long line in terms of how your end users could potentially do their development for you, how they commit that development into Azure, and how they then apply their changes to a pre-production version of the web app, and how that makes its way into production, just to give you the full picture of kind of what you could potentially be dealing with here on the side of the development. And Obviously, I couldn't leave this without actually giving you a little bit of a sample architecture in terms of how this could potentially work in terms of not just high availability, but also how does this work from a disaster recovery perspective? Because even though we're not dealing with virtual machines and networking, which is traditionally DR territory, DR still applies to something like this. You may end up using a very public-facing production website, for example, and you need guarantee that if there were to be a region failure for whatever reason in Azure, how can I get that back up and running in the partner region? So you may have seen on the tier slide that from a DR and HA perspective, Traffic Manager is supported for the standard and premium tiers of web apps. So if you've not used Traffic Manager before, it's a global service in Azure that allows an entry point via a URL, and it will basically load balance or redirect traffic to specific endpoints depending on how I set it, how I have that service set up. So in this example for Traffic Manager, I could have it set up to point to the primary web app in the primary region first. And if there's any failure of that primary region, then it will lose the heartbeat and it will automatically switch me over to the secondary region on that side of things. In terms of actually developing the actual web app, I have to have obviously 2 web apps existing on that side of things. So therefore, I need to take that into account. I need to deploy to both regions in terms of actual changes to the web apps, itself. And this just gives you an example of SQL as a backend as well. So this is just a very high level overview of just to demonstrate how DR could potentially work if you had that in mind going forwards, if you were to end up using web apps itself. Okay, so that was just a very brief introduction to Azure Web Apps. I hope you found that actually quite interesting. It's one of my favorite things to actually talk about because it's so shiny and new and lots of lovely features and slightly different to virtual machines. But in terms of dealing with virtual machines and dealing with just general deployments, this is where we like to talk a little bit about Azure Policy or Azure Policies, depending on where you see it in the portal. So to give you a little bit of kind of backstory around how this fits into your Azure usage. So on screen is what I like to think is an up-to-date version of the regions and data centers with Azure. I put this together yesterday. Chances are it's probably majorly out of date already, such as the speed that Azure works at these days. And what I'm going to do is overlay on top of that just a normal map, of the world. And I'm going to say, for example's sake, I've got Azure set up, and predominantly my regions, for whatever region, for data sovereignty or for any other compliance reasons, I'm using the UK and I'm using the European regions for all my deployments. So I go ahead and we've got a few virtual machines, and we're predominantly in Europe and UK for that. And the project is complete. I hand over to all the other teams to manage it like I do with my normal data center, and we just carry on as normal. And then for some reason over time, all of a sudden I've got VMs that have spun up in the US. And then for some reason, someone has spun up a PAS-SQL database and a very large VM on the other side of the US as well. And then all of a sudden SQL have been spun up in other regions and there's costs all over the place. I don't know where all these deployments are going. And it just ends up in a little bit of a potential mess because your data sovereignty rules have been broken, your internal compliance has been broken because people have used Azure and taken it on board, but they've just started to deploy things without maybe thinking it through a little bit in terms of the actual size of the deployment, the size of the VM, where it's actually going in Azure. So we kind of need something in place to be able to control where we're deploying stuff to, as well as helping us limit what we're actually deploying as a business into Azure. So this is where Azure Policies can kind of effectively keep you safe. In one way of putting it, it keeps you safe from yourself in a way as a business. So Azure Policies allows you to basically have specific requirements and control around all your deployments in Azure. So it can basically limit or it can basically deny certain deployments happening depending on what rules that you put in to your Azure environment. So we have 2 choices with Azure Policy. We can generally have things in audit mode, so it will audit compliances that are non-compliant, and we can then review that periodically. Or we have something called enforcement mode, where it won't audit it. If something's wrong, it will just either deny you from doing something, or it will just stop you cleaning your tracks from actually doing something in Azure. So we do have the Azure Policy Center, which is on screen at the moment, just a quick example, and you can review that periodically to show the overall compliance of your Azure estate, depending on the policies that you have put in place on that. So it will give you any non-compliance, anything that you need to look at, and it will give you a general percentage of compliance over time as well. That you can actually review. By default, it's last 7 days, but you can actually expand that as well if you really wanted to. So to give you some examples of how this actually works, we can deploy Azure Policy either at the subscription level, or we can do it against a particular resource group, depending on how you've got your deployment set up in Azure. If I do it at the subscription level, I can have exclusions set up as well. So for whatever reason, you may be testing something new for a new project, and therefore certain resource groups you want to exclude from certain policies while you do that testing. That is absolutely fine to be able to do that. And to give you some kind of common examples that we always reference when we're doing any Azure architecture work for our customers, we have things like you can limit VM sizes to specific VMs that you deploy. So you could say, I only want A series or D series or maybe E series, and I can limit what type of D and E series can be deployed. So for example, a DS13 virtual machine is quite a large VM. We see it a lot for SQL deployments, but it can be quite expensive. And therefore, you could have a policy in play where anything below a D11 is fine, but anything D11 or D13, for example, they try to deploy it, they'll get to the validation point on the deployment, and it will just error. And it will basically say you can't deploy this because policy forbids it. On that side of things. You can also limit locations. So you can, like we've had in the example, you could limit it just to the UK or European regions in Azure. You can also do that for your resource groups as well. And you can make sure your resource groups match the resources in terms of the location as well. So we often see from customers, the resource groups have been deployed in US, which is just metadata at the end of the day. It doesn't matter too much, but then the actual resources in the resource group are deployed in the correct region. So you can have a policy that makes sure that the resource groups and the resources match in terms of the actual deployment region that they're in as a policy for yourself as well. We could even be really granular about this, and we can actually have a list of all the resources available in Azure, and we can say we're only allowing certain resources for deployment. So for example, if you were doing a new project and you decided, right, we're going to do a data analytics project, but I don't want to use analysis services, you could deny the analysis services resource from being deployed in that subscription. So you can be very granular about it if you really wanted to, as well as a few other things like you can limit the storage account types into the replication. So you can only allow LRS, for example, and you can also audit any classic virtual machines or any classic resources that are in use as well. So it's not just about kind of your virtual machines. It's also security. Yeah, mix up my words. It's also security orientated as well in terms of the actual policies. So we can have things like we can make sure transparent data encryption is enabled on SQL at all times, for example. We can make sure that secure transfer is set on storage accounts, for example. We can make sure that the blob encryption is on our storage accounts. We can audit VMs that don't use the managed disk service, that are using the old school way of doing disk for your virtual machines. And if disaster recovery is very important to you in terms of the actual disaster recovery service in Azure, you can also audit VMs that are not using disaster recovery service, because that may be part of your security needs, that needs to happen for whatever reason, but you just don't have the time to keep track of it manually. As well as on top of that, we also have policies that will actually do stuff for you, like I was referring to in terms of the enforcement side of things. So, for example, you could set virtual machines where you build a VM and it will automatically deploy the anti-malware extension for you if it's not done as part of the virtual machine deployment, to make sure that is secure, and that may be part of your compliance requirements as well internally. You can even have extensions that will scan the internals of the virtual machine for any particular applications that you said shouldn't be installed on your virtual machines. So, for example, I've come across this where some customers will be quite new to Azure and they'll have a checklist for building virtual machines, and the end user may not be that familiar, and they may have a checklist that's very on-prem orientated, and they start installing things like agents and stuff like that that's used for on-prem but isn't valid in Azure. So you could actually have a policy to say don't install these applications, basically, or alert me if these applications are installed, because they shouldn't be for Azure perspective. And we can also enforce tagging in certain values as well. So that effectively means that if I want to have a tag or a label against certain virtual machines because I want to do cross-charging, for example, I don't have to always do it manually. I can basically say, build a virtual machine, and if it's against a certain resource group, apply this tag automatically. I don't want to have to worry about it to be able to do kind of cross-charging on that side of things. So in terms of Azure Policies, it's a relatively straightforward service, but it's a very powerful service in terms of allowing you to kind of have more control over your deployments in Azure, and allow you to kind of make it a bit more predictable and not have too many scares in terms of where on earth did this cost come from? Why on earth are we kind of deploying over there? Especially if you're have an internal audit process and you need to make sure you are compliant in terms of data sovereignty reasons on that side of things. So that is it from myself. So I'm going to hand over to Alex, and he's going to talk a little bit about Azure File Sync, which I'm actually really looking forward to because it's something that I want to learn more about myself, which should be good. So I'm just going to change presenter to Alex.
Hi guys, welcome to Azure File Sync. So I particularly like Azure File Sync because it's a hybrid technology, and it's not a big sort of jump to go from on-premise into Azure, which is a rather sort of easier toe in the water type approach to moving to Azure. So if we go back in time a little bit, and I'm showing my age here, almost didn't put in the point about NetWare. So for years now, traditional users have had perhaps a P, a public drive, a D, a departmental drive, and an H, and home drive, and they segment their work up, their Excel files, their Word documents into those drives. And what's happened is over the last 20 years is that data has grown and grown, partly I think because it's always sort of put on the IT department to manage the data, but it's not our data, so it's very difficult to manage. And partly there's been a general reduction in hardware costs over time. So what we've done is we've thrown storage at it. Disks have got bigger as well, so it's much easier for us to hold that data centrally. But of course, it's constant purchases. It's more disks, it's more hardware. It's upgrades over time as well. We've had to upgrade, Windows 2000 to 2003 to 28 to 2012, 2016, and some of you might even be newer than that now. But of course, as that data's grown, we've also got to consider the backups. So that's huge numbers of tapes, or maybe we're backing up to the cloud now. That we've got to DR those huge amounts of data as well. So this slide's really about those, perhaps the struggles or the pain points with that large amount of data. Sometimes you may want multiple copies of the data in different geographical locations so that people can get to it locally without a lot of latency. And the last point I really wanted to bring up with, some of you may have sort of stepped towards the hybrid cloud already, and Microsoft a few years ago brought out a store simple technology, which is very similar to Azure File Sync in that it tiers data into the cloud. But they have announced in the last month that their Store Simple 8000, which is their hardware series, is going to go end of support next year, and then end of extended support in 2022. So what that means is you've got 3 years more of Store Simple. And the reason I bring that up is because it's a very similar technology to Azure File Sync. And Microsoft, though they haven't officially announced it, they are leaning towards migrating users onto Azure File Sync. And in fact, some of their web pages already got processes for migrating from Store Simple to Azure File Sync. So if you're currently running Store Simple and you want to talk about that a bit more, then do contact your account manager or Chris and I directly, and we can talk about that. So yeah, summary where we are at the moment: large amounts of data built up over the years, and we probably need a way to maybe manage that data, keep the costs down, deal with backups and DR better. In comes Azure File Sync, but first of all, we're going to talk about Azure Files. So if you like, Microsoft's first implementation was a PaaS service of, if you like, SMB3 in Azure. So you can have a file share without having to control any of the underlying Windows services or hardware that sits beneath that file share. And they made it available in Azure as sort of SMB 2.1 and SMB 3.0. So you could access it from a Windows machine, a Macbox, Linux. You could even access it from on-premise. What you didn't have, though, certainly in the initial, and I think it's still not gone production yet, you've got the files there, but you haven't got those access control lists that we find around NTFS traditionally on a file server that says who can access what. So it was generally, you've got a file store and pretty much everybody can access it. So it didn't take there wasn't a lot of uptake. I think really it was driven towards applications that maybe wanted to store files temporarily, and that's where we saw it in use the most. It was very secure from a kind of encryption point, though, and then data was encrypted on the fly and in over SMB and on disk. So what they brought in now is something that's going to help us as more traditional on-premise people with file servers. So where are we now? Some of you may have moved to Office 365. We're seeing a massive move of data to Office 365, and part of that comes with it is your OneDrive, and OneDrive is a personal storage area for each user. So that old P drive I mentioned earlier, that data is probably being migrated to OneDrive, and that's a good solution. But there are many applications that still require SMB stored locally with low latency, and they've got access control to that file system as well. So what we need is perhaps an easy migration path to something new. This is where our Azure File Sync comes in. So really what we've got is a standard Windows server on-premise. It can be in Azure, but I'm really thinking on-premise, and that's going to be anything from Windows 2012 up to Windows 2019. On that server, we put an agent. So it's a standard Windows server. We put an agent on, and what Microsoft allows us to do is sync all of that data up to Azure. So we've got another copy of it in Azure, perhaps a backup, or perhaps for DR. So this tends to be a big driver. A lot of people with their file servers, huge amounts of data, they don't want to back it up in the traditional way. They don't want to DR it in the traditional way. So this is obviously a major driver. But the other factor that Microsoft give you here is this tiering technology. So if you're running out of space, for instance, locally, what you can do is say, well, I want the full copy of the data available to my users, but on my local file server, I'm just going to keep, say, 10% of the data, and you can tune it as much as you like. It's a very similar concept to what we used to have with Store Simple, but Store Simple was limited. You couldn't tune how much data you kept locally. The idea being that, let's say we've got 10 terabytes of data that's built up over the years. Actually, there's probably less than 5%, less than 500 gig that users use on a daily, weekly basis. We've probably got 9.5 terabytes that they don't look at very often at all. So that 9.5 terabytes could be up in Azure. What happens is, to the user, they see all the data locally on the file server. If they were to access a file that wasn't local, the agent would go up and pull that file down locally. So you might get a 1-second delay opening a file that isn't cached locally. But for most SMB applications and users, they aren't even going to notice that. This slide always sort of, I only wrote it a couple of weeks ago, and one of the things that is kind of a bit of a blocker for some customers is Windows deduplication. So I found in 2012 and Windows 2016, a lot of customers have switched that on their file servers, and they get really good, probably get 2-to-1 deduplication on a Windows 2016 file server comfortably. And when I wrote the slide, as I said 2 weeks ago, you couldn't then use Azure File Sync with that. But since then, you can. As Chris mentioned earlier, massive amount of energy and money goes into developing these products in Azure and changing them rapidly. So if you've got dedupe on your Windows file server, that's fine. It still supports Azure File Sync agent. And the data can be stored in anywhere in Europe, basically. So we've got 4 primarily public data centers in Europe. We've got West Europe, Amsterdam, North Europe, Dublin, UK South, which is London, and West, which is Wales. And all of those support Azure File Sync. So once again, in summary, it's an agent that goes on your file server, puts a complete copy of the data into Azure, and then you can also turn on tiering so that you don't have to have all the data stored locally. Lastly, you can have multiple copies of the data accessed in different branches, different branch servers. I'm going to draw a bigger picture next. Unfortunately, I kind of stole this off Microsoft, so immediately we start with a file share in New York because that's important to them. So let's say we've got a server in New York, a file server, lots of files, lots of users access it. Problem is, it runs out of disk space. Happens all the time. What we can do is create a file share in Azure, put the sync agent on our branch server in New York, and we can start syncing all of the data up to Azure, which is great. And traditionally, what we would have done this sort of scenario is go, right, maybe I'll put some more disks in the server or swap the server out completely and put a new one in. Of course, that does mean downtime and interruption to the users. But what we can do in this Azure scenario now is actually switch on tiering. As soon as we switch on tiering, we can have our same server, and all we've done is tell as the agent, right, keep, say, 10% of my disk space free. So what it's going to do is effectively tier some of that data up into Azure. And it uses a kind of hot block principle. So those files that are accessed more regularly are going to be kept local, and those files that haven't been accessed for a while will be up in Azure. So we fixed our problem running out of disk space. I would say we've got another server, also in America, funnily enough, and we want to be able to access the data in 2 locations. But we can do that. We can put the agent on our server in Seattle, and it will download the data there. We can also have a more global approach and have a duplicate file share. This feature is still in preview, but we can have one in East US data center and one in the West Europe data center, and have that data replicated across, and then have a branch office in Paris, which has also an identical copy of the data. By having West Europe and East US sync their data, we're actually creating a resilient global solution so that if something goes wrong with our connection to the file share in West Europe, or there's a problem with Azure West Europe, the branch office in Paris will automatically connect to the file share in East US to make sure it's got a full copy of the data, so you don't get that interruption to our users that might be connecting, or our applications, or even mobile devices that perhaps are using work folders to sync to Windows. So that's a very much an enterprise solution. And don't forget, we've still got this sort of ability to access these file shares in Azure directly. So if I had a virtual machine sitting in Azure, I may want to access that file share directly from that virtual machine, or a PaaS service could access it too. Lastly, we've also got integration to Azure Backup Vault. What that means is we can automatically, on a regular basis with minimal maintenance, back up this data. It's actually doing it in the background via snapshots, but it's all controlled through the Azure Backup Vault, as you may find you've got using that today on-prem or with virtual machines in Azure. So we're providing a backup solution, a DR solution, a tiering solution, and a globally resilient solution. I'm going to sort of reiterate this again. What are the main scenarios for it? Multi-site sync, keeping your data in different places. Cloud tiering, this is what I really like. So we can have smaller servers on site with less data on them. You can integrate the backup automatically with the Azure backup vaults. We can have direct cloud access if we want, and we can have rapid DR. Lastly, what's coming? What's new? Where are we now? So we've got encryption at rest. We've got network ACLs on those file shares that are sitting directly in Azure. We've got snapshots on the share. By default, you can have up to 200. You can have even more now with the if you manage it via the Azure backup vault. We've got ZRS storage. What that means is typically with a storage account like an Azure file share in Azure, you have something called LRS, with locally redundant storage, which keeps 3 separate copies of the data. You can choose, pay a little bit more to have ZRS, which is zone redundant storage. They're going to give you 6 copies of the data. They're going to guarantee that 3 of them are not, if you like, in the same data center. So an Azure region, let's say UK West, consists of more than one physical building, and they're going to put some of that data in another physical building. They've got their Azure data box now, which if I'm going to describe it as a big USB box. So rather than having, if you've got huge amounts of data, rather than having to sync it over the internet up to Azure, they send you in a secure mail system, a USB box. You can copy your data onto this USB box, send it up to Azure, or sorry, send it via the snail mail to Microsoft's data center. They'll import the data for you, and then you can just sync the changes afterwards. So if you've got large amounts of data, it's an easy way to get that data into Azure. They've got a file sync evaluation tool, so you can install this on one of your file servers, and it will tell you whether that file server will support Azure File Sync. It'll check for things like how many files you've got and whether the path lengths are too long. It supports a sort of standard character path lengths. So lastly, sorry, jump forward a little bit here. Let's see what's actually coming. So they've brought out something called premium file shares. So these are really for I/O intensive workloads, so they're backed by SSD disks. There's a limit at the moment, which is supposed to disappear in the summer on the standard file shares we've got available to at the moment, where each one can only be 5 terabytes in size, but you can have multiple ones on a server, and they're going to increase that to 100 terabytes. I've mentioned the cross-region sync already, so that's just about to come out. So we could have a file share in West US sync to West Europe. We're going to give us more control over our tiering policies. So at the moment, we say how much percentage of free space we want on a local disk. And they're going to give us more data export options. So that in a quick summary is Azure File Sync. It's a hybrid technology again. It allows us to use our traditional file servers with an agent to push that data into the cloud, automated backup, automated DR. Okay, guys, I hope that has been useful for everybody. If anybody's got any questions at all, then feel free to type them in the chat box now, and we'll endeavour to answer them for you.
Do our best anyway. And just while you're typing any questions out, obviously, if you have any further questions after we end the presentation, and if you speak to your account manager, obviously that you can go through them, and they will obviously endeavour to engage on that side of things as well, if need be.
We've implemented Azure File Sync for a few customers now, and it's been very successful.
It is something we get a lot of requests, I must admit. I think, Alex, you've done quite a few, like you say already. Store simple orientated and some not, I think. So that seems to be the way it's going as well. So we do have one question. Does File Sync have any integration for non-Windows storage, such as NetApp?
A really good question. Unfortunately not. So because the agent sits directly on the local file server, it's looking for a Windows system. When we've come across customers who have got NetApp, what we've done, and they might be using CIFS on Box, so effectively the NetApp's pretending to be a Windows file server. NetApp have got a new cloud solution which effectively allows you to run a virtual NetApp in Azure. So what we've done, and really their requirement, I'm talking sort of like backup and DR here, is we've had this virtual NetApp running in Azure, and we've used the built-in NetApp snap mirror technology to take a copy of the local data that's on premise and ship it up to the virtual NetApp in Azure. Excuse me. And that provides us with if you like, an extra copy of the data offsite for DR and backup reasons. That works quite well as a technology. I hope that answered it okay.
You answered it miles better than I could. So thank God you're here.
Yeah, we've got some customers we're deploying Store Simples with at the moment, and it's quite a tricky scenario because we kind of recommended that technology, and then Microsoft had come out and sort of said, well, we've only got another 3 years left on that, and we have to sort of think about, right, are we going to be using Azure File Sync now instead? So if you want to have that, we've got lots of customers at Store Simple, so if you want to have that conversation, then please do contact us.
I just got another question from Andy Barlow. Is it possible to set a policy based on the size of the file and also the date of the file, not just how much space is cached?
Not yet, but it's coming. So that question does get asked, and Microsoft are like, yeah, we're working on it. So unfortunately, at the moment, you can only do it by free space. But they are going to give us more options.
And has Azure AD integration support, doesn't it, for policies? Or is it normal? Sorry, it's AD. Sorry, I'm talking rubbish. AD integration as well on File Sync as well.
Yeah. So obviously, with your local copy of your data on your traditional Windows file server, you've got AT integration, you've got your NTFS ACLs that sit around that. So that's data is stored, and when it's replicated up to Azure, it's there, but you never used to be able to access it if you were connecting to Azure directly. If you had another file server that also had the distinct copy of that data, it had all the NTFS ACLs, so all the permissions were still there. But what Microsoft are kind of previewing, I believe, at the moment, is if you're accessing it directly in Azure, those NTFS ACLs are also available. So currently, if you've got an on-premise file server, those ACLs are absolutely there as they would be normally, and they're available on another file server if you were to DR it or just access it from a different geographical location. And what they're going to bring in is those ACLs available if you access the data directly in Azure, say from a virtual machine that's sitting in Azure.
Cool, nice one. And we've got just another question from, sorry, as Andy asked the last question previously, is there any timescale for the size date policy and AD integration to be added?
I don't know the answer to that, actually. We'll have to come back to you, Andy.
And
come back to you.
And can we enable snapshots or shadow copy for File Sync?
Yeah, so you could. So on the local file server, you could absolutely have VSS running and use local snapshots. Obviously, that snapshot wouldn't have the full copy of the data. It would have whatever was sort of stored locally at the time. What you can also do though is on your Azure file share in Azure itself, so you can enable snapshots, which are a bit like VSS snapshots, and that will have a full copy of the data.
So it's worth mentioning as well, is the Azure backup service, the way the backup service Vault actually works is using VSS effectively via snapshots as well. So it's VSS pretty much integrated all the way along the chain on that side of things. That's one. No problem. Cool. Okay. Probably wrap it up at this point. So thank you very much for coming and joining the webinar. It really is appreciated. Make sure to speak to your account managers, and we will have more webinars in future. So just take the opportunity to say thank you very much, everyone.
Thanks, guys. And if you want a recording, I believe we'll put some sort of link out, Chris. Yeah.
Yeah, we will do. Yeah, brilliant. Thank you, everyone. Cheers.
Thank you.